Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. The first article deals with the ongoing border tensions between India and China along the line of actual control in the eastern Ladakh region. These tensions have been going on since April 2020, and it finally appears that India and China might have worked out a settlement, at least in the Penong Tso region. In a major development, both India and China have announced that they have begun a synchronized and coordinated disengagement in the northern and southern bank areas of the strategic Penong Tso Lake. The Defence Minister Rajnath Singh has informed the Rajya Sabha about this development, and it has been followed up by China as well with a similar announcement. So in this context, we need to understand the significance of this disengagement. And let's begin the discussion by understanding the state of border tensions between India and China. See, the emergence of border tensions between India and China dates back to the 1950s, which eventually culminated in the 1962 war. During this conflict, China ended up occupying around 38,000 square kilometers of territory that was claimed by India in a region known as Aksai Chin, which was a part of Ladakh's territory. See, the border dispute between India and China can be divided into three sectors: the western sector, the middle sector, and the eastern sector. In the western sector, since the 1950s, China started claiming Aksai Chin because of its strategic location, which helps in connecting the Xinjiang province of China with the Tibetan province. These claims of China were disputed by India because it believed Aksai Chin to be an integral part of the Ladakh region of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Then in the eastern sector, a new dispute emerged in the 1950s when China rejected the validity of the McMahon Line. The McMahon Line was the border that was drawn up between Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet through the Shimla Convention of 1914, which was worked out between the British India government and the Tibetan Kingdom. Post-independence, India went on to recognize the validity of the McMahon Line as the de facto border between Arunachal Pradesh and Tibet. But however, the modern Chinese state, that is the People's Republic of China, which was established in the late 1940s, rejected the McMahon Line by stating that neither the PRC nor the modern Indian government were parties to the Shimla Convention, which was worked out between the British and the Tibetan Kingdom in 1914. So thereby, China triggered a new dispute in the eastern sector, and it started claiming the whole state of Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet. These border disputes and tensions in the 1950s eventually led to the 1962 war, during which China occupied Aksai Chin, and it had also made deep incursions into Arunachal Pradesh. But following the end of the war, China retreated from the occupied areas in Arunachal Pradesh, but however, it retained Aksai Chin, and till date, it continues to remain under Chinese occupation. Then following this war, a nexus began to form between Pakistan and China, and as a result in 1963, China and Pakistan signed a boundary agreement through which Pakistan illegally ceded the Shaksgam Valley located over here in the Gilgit-Baltistan region, and thus another 5,000 square kilometers of Indian territory that had been occupied by Pakistan was illegally ceded to China. So in total, around 43,000 square kilometers of Indian territory is under Chinese occupation in the western sector alone. But however, in the eastern sector and along the borders of Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, China doesn't occupy any Indian territory, and in these two areas, both the sides have only differing perceptions about their borders, which often results in incursions and clashes. India, on the other hand, has firmly maintained since the 1950s that Aksai Chin and as well as the Shaksgam Valley is an integral part of India, and this in turn results in frequent clashes and incursions along the de facto border over here in the western sector known as the LAC or the Line of Actual Control. Then apart from the western and the eastern sector, India-China also have an issue in the middle sector, that is near Bhutan. This dispute refers to the Doklam dispute at the Doklam Plateau, which is essentially a border dispute between China and Bhutan. Doklam Plateau is a strategic plateau located at the tri-junction of India, China and Bhutan, and a major military standoff had occurred in this region as well back in 2017. Even though this is essentially a border dispute between China and Bhutan, India also gets eventually involved because India is largely responsible for the defense of Bhutan. Plus, for India, the Doklam Plateau is of great strategic significance. So these differing perceptions of the border between India and China has led to repeated incursions and clashes at the western, middle and eastern sectors, specifically in the Aksai Chin Ladakh region, at the Doklam Plateau and over the status of Arunachal Pradesh respectively. After years of peace and stability between India and China over the border dispute, last year in April 2020, China began carrying out a series of deliberate incursions across multiple locations along the line of actual control, which openly challenged India's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Beginning from the month of April, going all the way up to May, June and July, China carried out a series of incursions across multiple locations, including the Depsang Plain region located over here near Daulat Beg Oldi. To its north, you can even find the strategic Karakoram Pass. Then within a few days, incursions took place at the strategic Galwan River Valley located over here, right next to the line of actual control. And this was followed by similar clashes in the Hot Springs area located over here and as well as at the strategic Panong So Lake. These deliberate incursions of China along the LAC led to a serious military standoff between the two countries, and this even led to a series of clashes between the Indian and the Chinese troops in the month of June at the Galwan River Valley, during which around 20 Indian soldiers were martyred as well. China followed this up by challenging India's claims in the North Bank area of the Panong So Lake, especially over the so-called finger areas. Following these grave acts of provocation by China, India also retaliated and carried out a counter-mobilization in order to defend its interpretation of the line of actual control. Then, as the incursions and clashes kept happening, multiple attempts were made to hold talks and negotiations with the Chinese side as per agreed commitments under the several border agreements that we have signed. But during these talks and negotiations, China always held the leverage and an advantageous position over India because of its ability to dominate the Depsang Plains, the Galwan River Valley, the Hot Spring area, and especially the north bank of the Panong So Lake. So in the month of June and July, when the negotiations began, India was actually negotiating from a weaker position, and China held a strong leverage against India. So realizing that China would misuse its advantageous position against India, a daring counter-preemptive operation was carried out by the Indian forces in the month of August at the south bank of the Panong So Lake. After China had triggered all these incursions, India opened up a new front along the south bank of the Panong So Lake, and during this retaliatory operation, the Indian Army, along with commandos of the Special Frontier Force, which is a special force of India's external intelligence agency, the RAW, India managed to occupy several strategic areas in the south bank of the Panong So Lake region. These tactical operations of India was carried out in the Chushul sector, and during this operation, several strategic locations such as the Spangur Gap, the Rechin La and the Rezangla Pass were occupied by the Indian forces, which gave India as well a advantageous position over Chinese military camps, especially over the garrison located at Moldo. So this counter operation of India gave us the much needed leverage with regard to the ongoing talks and negotiations, during which China was repeatedly failing to uphold its end of the commitment as per the several border agreements that we have signed. So after China held a dominating position at the north bank of the Panong So Lake, India retaliated along the south bank, and it occupied several important locations in the Chushul sector, especially at Spangur Gap, Rezangla and Rechinla. Through this military leverage, India started pushing China towards talks and negotiations, because China had clearly failed to uphold its commitments under the border agreements, which was essentially responsible for triggering these conflicts across multiple locations along the LAC. See, there are three primary border agreements between India and China that provides for the de-escalation of tensions in such eventualities. And the first such agreement was signed back in 1993, known as the Agreement on Maintenance of Peace and Tranquility along the LAC. Under this agreement, both the sides had agreed not to overstep each other's perception of the line of actual control, because both the sides had a different view of the exact alignment of the LAC. Under this agreement, India-China also agreed to pull back their troops if there was any caution issued by the other side in case of any accidental missteps. Then it also mandated the two armed forces to maintain very minimum level of forces in the border areas, including minimum deployment of heavy weaponry such as artillery guns, missiles, fighter jets, etc. Then in 1996, another agreement was signed to promote confidence building measures between the two sides, and it mandated the two armed forces to exercise self-restraint in case of any incursions or clashes, and it mandates both the sides to take up diplomatic consultation along with constant talks between senior military commanders in order to immediately disengage from the standoff. The agreement also prohibits the two sides from opening heavy fire against each other, and it also places restrictions on holding large military exercises near the LAC. All these provisions were put in under the 1996 agreement in order to ensure that a minor incursion or a minor clash doesn't end up escalating into a larger conflict, and it was designed to provide an opportunity for diplomatic consultation and talks between senior military commanders so that immediate disengagement can be carried out. Then in 2013, the Border Defense Cooperation Agreement was signed between India and China, which mandates the two armed forces to not follow or trail the patrolling parties of each other if they accidentally cross over the LAC. So the existence of these checks and balances was seen as a hedge against a larger conflict between India and China as a result of minor incursions and clashes at the local border levels. But however, we have noticed that China has willingly violated all these commitments since April 2020, and it had significantly stepped up tensions against India. But following the leverage that India gained at the south bank of the Penong So Lake, several rounds of talks were held between senior military commanders in order to disengage and restore normalcy to the border areas. Under this engagement, multiple rounds of negotiations have been held between senior military commanders at the ground level, and finally it appears that both the sides have achieved a major breakthrough. So as announced by India and China, a synchronized coordinated disengagement process is being taken up by both the sides, and the initial focus is to disengage from the north bank and the south bank of the Penong So Lake. See, the Penong So Lake is a strategic lake that is located on the LAC between India and China, and around 2/3 of this water body is with China, whereas India holds control over 1/3 of the Penong So Lake region. So along the banks of this lake, there are these mountain ridges which are referred to as the fingers of the lake, and there are 8 such fingers which are identified in the north bank of the Penong So Lake. This map clearly shows the LAC as perceived by India. According to India's claims, the line of actual control extends until finger 8 of the Penong So Lake in the North Bank region. Right next to these claims of India, China maintains a strong military base which is supported and backed by very strong logistics, as China has managed to build several roads and key infrastructure in and around the finger 8 areas. On the other hand, China's perception of the LAC passed through finger 4 over here, thereby resulting in an overlapping claim between India and China that spread across a region of 8 kilometers. So China, due to its enhanced infrastructure, was frequently patrolling these areas up till finger 4 in direct violation of the claims by India. On the other hand, India's last military post is located near finger 3, known as the Dan Singh Tapa post, and from here, Indian troops would often patrol on foot up till Finger 8. Because unlike China, on the Indian side, there aren't sufficient roads to provide for patrolling, and it was this differing perception in the overlapping area which led to the clashes and military standoff of last year. In April and May 2020, the Chinese troops started establishing a permanent presence in the Finger 4, Finger 5, Finger 6 and Finger 7 areas, and they started preventing the Indian patrols which were trying to reach Finger 8 as per India's claims of the LAC. So this led to a series of clashes between the troops, and it eventually turned into one of the largest military standoffs between the two sides. So following these clashes, both the sides started mobilizing heavy weaponry, including battle tanks, artillery guns, fighter jets, etc. After months of heightened tensions, a series of negotiations took place, and in the meantime, India also gained a leverage by occupying several strategic areas in the South Bank in the month of August. So since then, multiple rounds of negotiations have taken place, and finally they have come to an agreement to carry out a synchronized and coordinated disengagement at both the North Bank and South Bank of the Penong So Lake. As per this agreement, this overlapping claim zone will be declared as a no patrol zone for the time being, and all the Chinese troops will pull back to the Finger 8 area, that is to the eastern part of Finger 8, and return to the Chinese bases. And China has also committed to remove any temporary or permanent infrastructure that it has created in this overlapping zone. On the other hand, India has also agreed to pull back all its troops from Finger 4 and return them back to this post at Finger 3 known as the Dan Singh Tapa post. So essentially, as a result of this disengagement that has been worked out, between Finger 4 and Finger 8, a buffer zone of 8 kilometers is being created, which is being declared as a no patrol zone for both the countries. And both the sides have also been mandated to remove any temporary or permanent infrastructure that they might have created over the last few months. But however, please note that this disengagement that has been worked out, it is limited to the North Bank and the South Banks of the Penong So Lake, and it doesn't apply to other friction points such as Hot Springs area, the Galwan River Valley and the Depsang Plains. So in this context, this editorial on page number 6 considers this to be a promising start for de-escalating tensions between India and China and for restoring normalcy in their relationship. But however, the success of this disengagement entirely lies upon its implementation, and the only concern is with regard to China's willingness to fulfill its commitments. Because even in the past few months, China had made several commitments for disengagement, but on the ground, China would not fulfill its commitments. During talks and negotiations, China would make a lot of promises, but on the ground there would be no changes. So this failure of China to uphold its commitments has created a lot of distrust between the two countries. So now the time has come for China to fulfill its end of the agreement in the interest of the broader relationship between India and China, which happen to be two of the most populous nations in the world. And it's absolutely essential and vital for the two countries to disengage and restore peace and normalcy as far as their border dispute is concerned. The editorial also points out that this disengagement at the Penong So Lake should result in the resolution of other friction points as well, such as Hot Springs area, Depsang Plains and the Galwan River Valley, because we can't allow these flashpoints to persist, because even these minor disputes and incursions could escalate and turn into a major conflict or a full-fledged war between the two sides. And considering the consequences of such a conflict, neither of the side can afford the impact, and hence it's absolutely essential to rebuild trust into the relationship and complete this disengagement process. Now let's take up another editorial that evaluates the proposed bill to ban all private cryptocurrencies. See, cryptocurrencies are essentially digital currencies, and the first cryptocurrency that was developed was Bitcoin by an anonymous entity known as Satoshi Nakamoto. This anonymous individual or entity brought out a white paper a decade ago, which gave birth to a revolutionary technology known as blockchain technology that could serve as the basis for cryptocurrencies or digital currencies. Based on this concept, Bitcoin gained a lot of popularity over the last 1 decade, and it has also given birth to several other alternative private currencies such as Ethereum, Ripple, Doge, Litecoin, Binance, etc. These cryptocurrencies have grown in their prominence around the world and have increasingly become acceptable and are being adopted around the world, thereby leading to a decentralized parallel economy which is not controlled by any entity. Because the very essence of blockchain and Bitcoin is based on the decentralized model. See, in a traditional economy, the legal tender is the fiat currency that is guaranteed by the government and that is printed by the central bank. These fiat currencies are physical currencies which provides for our economic transactions, and even their online version of transactions is entirely managed by several middlemen or mid-level institutions such as banks and financial institutions, and overall it is strictly regulated by the central bank with the supervision of the government. So traditional currencies in a traditional economy, they are highly centralized and they are tightly regulated. So what Satoshi Nakamoto proposed was a revolutionary alternative which would take the control away from these governments and central banks and provide for a decentralized economy based on a decentralized encrypted currency known as a cryptocurrency or a digital currency. And the underlying technology for these currencies was the blockchain technology. See, in a traditional economy, all the financial transactions that are taking place, they are recorded, and the accounts of all these transactions are maintained by the mid-level institutions, that is the banks and the financial institutions, in their respective records and accounts book, or also known as ledgers. These ledgers and the overall functioning of the banks and the financial institutions are in turn regulated by the central bank and supervised by the government. But in the world of cryptocurrencies, instead of having a centralized ledger that is managed by controlling and regulatory authorities, blockchain technology provides for a decentralized ledger where different users, different nodes, and different peers maintain the transactions and provide for certification and authentication of these transactions. So the proponents of cryptocurrencies, they hail this as a revolutionary technology that is going to democratize money and lead to the creation of decentralized finance, or also known as DeFi. But however, serious concerns have also been raised over the possible misuse of cryptocurrencies because they provide complete anonymity to the investors and the users, and they are also encrypted with very high level cryptography. So this decentralized, unregulated and anonymous nature of the cryptocurrencies has already been misused, and it has become the preferred currency for money laundering groups, organized criminal cartels, for terror financing, and also for those who are involved in cyber crimes. So today on the internet, especially on the dark net, a lot of illicit activities are being transacted with cryptocurrencies, including drugs trafficking, arms trafficking, etc. Then upon this, cryptocurrencies, they have no underlying asset. They're not tied to any reliable solid asset, and this makes the cryptocurrencies extremely volatile and a speculative asset for investment. Whereas on the other hand, fiat currencies are usually tied to gold or to government debt, and they not only have solid reliable underlying assets that provides them value, but their value is also guaranteed by the government, and you also have a dedicated central bank that is committed to keeping the value of the fiat currency as stable as possible. But in the case of cryptocurrencies, there is no underlying asset, and this makes it extremely volatile and speculative, and this is what explains the wild and violent swings that most of the cryptocurrencies have seen in the last few years. Take Bitcoin for example. In the initial years, Bitcoins were virtually worthless and they were not even taken seriously. But as interest in cryptocurrencies grew and as Bitcoin became popular, its value shot up exponentially, and each Bitcoin was valued in the range of 12 to 19,000 US dollars back in 2017 before it eventually crashed and came back to the range of around 4 to 5,000 US dollars. But following the breakout of the pandemic last year, central banks around the world, they have printed enormous amount of currencies in order to revive economic growth, and even governments have announced massive fiscal stimulus packages, which in turn has created a flood of liquidity in the global markets. So due to this sudden increase in liquidity following the pandemic, investors around the world are worried about inflationary concerns. And this excess liquidity not only contributed to the boom in stock markets around the world, led by millions and millions of new retail investors who were joining the investor bandwagon, it also contributed to an exponential boom in the crypto markets as well. So in the last few months, the value of most of the cryptocurrencies has increased exponentially, and one Bitcoin alone is valued today in the range of 48 to 49,000 US dollars. Even other popular cryptocurrencies such as Ethereum, Binance, Ripple, and even Doge, which was created as a joke cryptocurrency, even they have boomed exponentially. And this sudden and significant increase in their market capitalization has also led to their increased adoption in the formal economy. Several large companies such as Tesla, MasterCard, PayPal, and even several large hedge funds and mutual funds such as BlackRock, they have not only started investing in cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, they have also started accepting them as formal payment. So this exponential boom in the crypto markets and the rising adoption of cryptocurrencies seen around the world has also had an impact in India. Over the last few months, millions of new investors have joined this ongoing cryptocurrency boom, and they have signed up on several cryptocurrency exchanges and they have opened their own digital wallets. According to reports, in India, close to 10,000 crore rupees have been invested in cryptocurrencies. And this increase in investor interest and this increase in adoption in India is in stark contrast to the conservative policy that the government and the RBI have adopted against cryptocurrencies. Back in 2017 and 18, when cryptocurrencies were booming, especially Bitcoin, the government declared it as not a legal tender, and the RBI and even several government institutions, they took a firm stand against cryptocurrencies. Even though they didn't go to the extent of banning cryptocurrencies, several administrative and regulatory measures were taken to prevent investments in cryptocurrencies and to prevent their trading. For example, the RBI issued a formal notice to all the banks in the country to stop providing services for cryptocurrency investments. Following this, several Indian investors, led by Indian cryptocurrency exchanges, they approached the Supreme Court, and eventually the government and the RBI, they failed to convince the Supreme Court about the drawbacks of cryptocurrencies. And since there was no legal ban in the country, the Supreme Court went ahead to lift these restrictions back in 2020, and it again triggered an exponential growth in the crypto markets in India. So in the last 7 to 8 months, even India has joined the ongoing global rally in the crypto markets, and millions of Indians have invested in cryptocurrencies. Now suddenly, to everyone's shock, the government has proposed a cryptocurrency bill which is likely to be tabled in the ongoing budget session. Even though the exact details of the bill is still not available in the public domain, it has become very clear from several reports that the government is likely to impose an outright ban on all private cryptocurrencies. Because this was recommended by the interministerial committee that was constituted by the government, and here the editorial reminds the government to take lessons from China's experience with banning cryptocurrencies. See, in China, there is not only a ban on cryptocurrencies, but the internet in China is very strictly controlled by the state. But despite that, China has not been able to wipe out cryptocurrency transactions, and even though the volumes are low in China, it still continues to persist. Because anything that is built on an open technology and open platform, such as the internet and the blockchain, is going to flourish despite a ban, and it might be very difficult to enforce the ban for the government and the regulatory institutions. Plus, on the positive side, cryptocurrencies can serve a number of purposes, and it also holds tremendous potential for the future of the economy as it is being currently witnessed in other parts of the world, especially in developed countries. But despite these global lessons, the interministerial committee set up by the government, recommended an outright ban on all private cryptocurrencies, and most likely this recommendation is likely to be adopted in the proposed bill which the government is looking to table and pass in the ongoing budget session. Along with banning all private cryptocurrencies, it is also looking to promote the underlying technological platform, that is blockchain technology, because it can serve several other purposes, especially with regard to conduct of e-elections. And this decentralized technology could also revolutionize several other areas of governance. So the proposed bill is not going to ban blockchain technology. Instead, it will look to promote the platform to develop several government services on this platform. Next, the bill is also likely to propose an official digital currency that would be brought out by the RBI, which is likely to be tagged to the official fiat currency. So this proposed ban has already created a lot of concern amongst the investors and several Indian startups which are providing exchange services and wallet services. So in this context, the editorial points out that the government should learn lessons from the rest of the world, and instead of imposing an outright ban on cryptocurrencies, which might be counterproductive, it is better for the government to ensure smart regulation which will help in exploiting the potential benefits of cryptocurrencies while simultaneously dealing with its potential misuse and its volatility. Next, on page number 6 and as well as on page number 7, we have two columns that are related to the recent floods that occurred in Uttarakhand. These columns are analyzing the increasing frequency and amplitude of disasters in the Himalayan ecosystem and how this environmental threat is being aggravated by unsustainable development in the region. These columns even explore the links of these disasters with climate change and global warming, and this is a discussion that we have had in detail over the last few weeks. So I would request you to go through these columns once. Next, on page number 5, we have an article according to which the Koch Rajbongshis are demanding ST status, and this article examines the links of these demands with electoral politics. See, the Koch Rajbongshis are a community that trace back their roots to the Kamta kingdom, which ruled over various parts of Assam, West Bengal, Bangladesh, Bihar, even few parts of Nepal and several other parts of northeast India during the medieval period. This community was a dominant community in this region and it ruled over a territory known as the Kamtapur. During British rule, a large part of this region became a part of the princely state of Cooch Behar, which eventually merged with the state of West Bengal following India's independence. So today, the Koch Rajbongshis, which are an indigenous community, they are found in Assam, parts of Meghalaya, parts of northern West Bengal, parts of Bihar, Bangladesh, and even Nepal, and even in few parts of Bhutan. Their population is estimated to be more than 3 million in West Bengal alone, and they also have a strong presence in few parts of Assam. Within Assam, it is said to be one of the largest communities, and it is said to have its own unique language and culture, and the Koch Rajbongshis are known to take a lot of pride in the Kamtapuri language. Within Assam, the Koch Rajbongshis, they have felt discriminated against by the native Assamese and as well as by other tribes and insurgent movements in the region, especially the ones led by the Bodos. So since many years, several political organizations representing the Koch Rajbongshis in West Bengal and Assam, they have come together to demand a separate Kamtapur state comprising of these areas. While the political outfits have largely demanded statehood within India and within the Indian constitution, some of the radical and extremist elements even went on to establish an insurgent terrorist outfit known as the KLO, or the Kamtapur Liberation Organization, which was set up back in 1995. This insurgent group turned the ongoing political movement into a separatist movement, demanding separatism and independence from India, and it was seeking to establish Kamtapur as an independent nation. So for several years, the KLO was known to carry out major terror attacks in the region, but eventually its activities have been curbed due to effective counter-insurgency operations that have been conducted by the security forces. In the meantime, the state government, the central government, and the political parties, including regional and national level political parties, they have tried to please the Koch Rajbongshi community by trying to fulfill some of their genuine political demands. So, this political race for fulfilling their demands eventually started having electoral implications, and many regional and national level political parties look at the community as a vote bank. So, last year, the government of Assam declared the establishment of an autonomous council for the Koch Rajbongshis in the Kamtapur region, known as the Kamtapur Autonomous Council. Right now, the community is demanding ST status or the tag of the scheduled tribe in order to enjoy the benefits of reservation and other privileges and protection that is offered by the constitution. So, as the states of West Bengal and Assam are heading for elections, the central government, regional parties and national level political parties, they are competing with each other to fulfill this long-standing political demand to grant the ST status to the Koch Rajbongshis, considering their electoral impact. Now let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: the disengagement at the LAC is vital for the broader relationship with China. Discuss. The second question: instead of shutting out cryptocurrencies, the government must ensure smart regulation. Examine in the context of rising global adoption of cryptocurrencies and the proposed bill in India to ban them. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.